What is up, guys? Wrestling Premiere is here. WWE's roster had become one of the greatest in wrestling history after the purchase of WCW, but it was also a welcoming dilemma. The roster was too big to showcase all these talent, not to mention that there was new guys coming in from OVW, thus the brand split was created. It was originally supposed to be WCW and WWF. Raw would go to WCW and SmackDown would remain with the WWF. Vince was very giving in this position because it was the only way to make the brand split work. But then the TV execs and the fans hated the Nitro thing and so it was scrapped. Once the invasion was officially over, plans were in motion for the real brand split that we're all familiar with. The vision of the brand split was a simple one. More pay-per-view events, more opportunities for wrestlers to shine, and more money. But it was still a huge risk and almost guaranteed that the ratings would take a hit. Because Raw and SmackDown had everyone on them. The Rock, Stone Cold, The Undertaker, Triple H, and with this change, you see half of the star power on each show. It meant that the WWF had to be committed to this idea and take a hit. The brand split originally was supposed to be led by Stone Cold and The Rock. It was also driven by a big storyline between Mr. McMahon and Ric Flair that saw both men have to compromise to create their own vision of the WWF, and that meant they had to split the brands. While Rock and Austin did not fit the actual plans as time went on, I really liked the concept of the original brand split. Both shows had a significantly different identity already with the color scheme and stage, but even the type of wrestlers felt different for both Raw and SmackDown. So much so that whenever you watch the early brand split and see the likes of Jericho and Triple H on SmackDown, it feels a bit weird. You couldn't say the same for somebody like Brock Lesnar, The Rock, and Edge. They fit SmackDown. The shows were different from each other and that helps WWE overall because it offers variety. You don't go to Raw expecting the same stuff as SmackDown. Sure, you'd want the wrestling to be better on Raw or something like that, but the characters, the stories, they were different. The brand split officially set in after SummerSlam, with the previous 4 months seeing each show tinker with their style. Both of them were where they wanted to be in terms of identity and vision, especially SmackDown. Of course, the freaked out stories that Diddy McMahon and Diddy Heyman booked were on both shows. That's a common thing, you know, it's very expected. But they were so separate, the pacing of the shows were different. Like the second hour would start on Raw with a segment for the most part, whereas SmackDown had a match. You know, the top of the hour is a very important time on TV, and SmackDown just allowed for Los Guerreros, Rey Mysterio, and these guys to wrestle during that hour instead of having segments. SmackDown wanted to be sports entertainment just as much as it wanted to be pro wrestling. The good thing about the early days of the brand split is how whenever somebody from the other brand would show up, they'd look out of place. Eric Bischoff on SmackDown with the commentary treating him like the enemy and somebody they want no part of. That brought excitement whenever some random mid-carder would show up. It seemed like a huge deal. The mid-carder looked like a main eventer just by showing up on SmackDown for a moment. The brand split had some novelty too. At one point, the Raw brand had the Intercontinental Championship, whereas SmackDown didn't have one. They did have the Cruiserweight Championship, and the Cruiserweights were a bit of a selling point for the SmackDown brand in the early days. In fact, the Cruiserweight division was the most distinctive thing on either show because Raw couldn't replicate it. They did have the women's division, but it wasn't rare to see a women's match on SmackDown, even if the quality was significantly lower. The dual brand pay-per-views were eventually going to come to an end, but I personally prefer them over the brand exclusive ones. I understand why they do it, and I'll get into it in a moment. The commentary itself was different. JR and the King were what WWE wanted, whereas Taz and Michael Cole wouldn't look out of place commentating a basketball game, and I say that as a compliment. They had incredible chemistry together, and some of the best calls from that decade involved those two. Well, here comes the pain. The ring just imploded. He cheated. So many moments. As the months went by, the brand split unfortunately stopped enforcing rules. The Rock, who was a major name, just showed up on Raw and became a member of the brand. He's The Rock, of course, but Stephanie was making a big fuss about Triple H months ago. And the inclusion of the World Heavyweight Championship was one to get used to. The Undisputed Championship felt like the ultimate prize, but it's understandable why they did it. The champion would have to travel all these miles for different house shows, the actual TV shows. Brock Lesnar probably would have stormed off after WrestleMania 19 if he was going to Raw house shows back and forth. The brand split did affect the ratings, but its intentions were beginning to come to fruition. Certain new talent got over in big ways. Rey Mysterio just debuted and took the world by storm on SmackDown. John Cena, who probably would have gotten released if there wasn't a brand split, developed his rap character. Randy Orton and Batista were under Triple H's wing, and Edge on SmackDown got to actually show his skills as a singles wrestler. He was already doing decently previously, but now he was even challenging for the WWE Championship and having a heated feud with Eddie Guerrero. And Guerrero himself got a second chance to the point where he ended up becoming the WWE Champion, which might have never happened without the brand split. Although if Guerrero did get over the way he did in 2003, Benoit will probably be the one shafted. And I do wonder about a world without the brand split. I'd guess WrestleMania 19 would still be Angle and Lesnar, but this is just assumptions again. I have to guess Triple H would face Austin again, and Goldberg debuts against The Rock. It's a weird world to think about because it probably changes the entire trajectory of the WWE, from John Cena leading things to Batista's push. 2003 was a year where the brand split was comfortable. There was nothing to get used to here, but for as much bad as you could talk about the business, it was slowly starting to see an uptick. The talent they wanted to showcase were doing much better, the brands had their own pay-per-views, And these pay-per-views were honestly not that good. The SmackDown ones were good at first. They're blowing Raws out of the water. Whenever that happens, you just know that when the draft goes down, everything changes. But I like the way the brands were treated. You rarely would see somebody from Raw on SmackDown and vice versa. SmackDown did well for itself, but then came WrestleMania 20. By this point, you see the vision for the WWE. Maybe the brand split was a good decision. Sure, it hit them hard early on, but at this point, the audience was used to it and you saw new guys on top. Eddie Guerrero and Chris Benoit were in World Championship matches, and it sounds absurd from a 2003 standpoint to say that, but this was what WWE was doing in 2004. They finally began working on inter-promotional stories. One of those was The Undertaker and Kane, which of course stems from the Buried Alive match at Survivor Series 2003. The pendulum though would swing after WrestleMania 20 as WWE did the draft. Goldberg and Brock Lesnar departed, and instead of WWE making things even for both shows, the SmackDown got slapped in the face with a steel chair. Heading into this draft, both shows are equal. While WWE might prefer Raw just a little in the way it's presented, SmackDown still had talent like Brock Lesnar, Kurt Angle, and The Undertaker. Well, right after WrestleMania 20, they only had The Undertaker from those three. Angle needed a break and was contemplating retirement. Big Show needed a break as well, had to disappear. And they did this tease of having Triple H go to SmackDown, which honestly would have been fresh and done wonders to the show. I think if Triple H goes to SmackDown and HBK turns heel on Raw, it would work. But instead, they got 2004 Booker T and 2004 Dudleys to get traded in exchange for Triple H. I would never make that trade. Like, Booker T could have been bigger in that era, but at this point, they needed to rebuild him. The trade is so dumb when you look at it. The Dudleys and Booker T for Triple H. SmackDown had to go with an unproven main eventer by the name of Bradshaw, and it was so tough to get the fans to buy into this new character. Initially, he looked out of place, but as the name John Bradshaw Layfield grew, it turned out to be the right direction. I believe Eddie Guerrero was a huge reason for why that character of JBL's rose up, because they were polar opposites. Business-wise, that feud didn't do well, but I personally don't care. Judgment Day 2004 is a classic in my eyes with JBL, the secret investor of ICE, up against Latino Heat, the WWE champion Eddie Guerrero. That's classic professional wrestling for me. I don't care if it didn't draw. I don't care. Legitimately, it's one of my favorite matches of the 2000s, and it'll always be because they had a deep, fury, intense story, a personal story, which was different from everything we seen on Raw and SmackDown at the time, and it built up to the pay-per-view in a wonderful way. JBL did get comfortable in that position, but it was a matter of them buying time. You know, they were trying to waste time until the new stars were established. Raw, on the other hand, became the wrestling show with Chris Benoit becoming the show's workhorse. And I forgot to mention, but his appearance on the Raw after the Raw Rumble was cool. Anytime JR would shout that this wasn't UPN, you knew it was a big deal. He did this with The Rock's return to Raw. Benoit won the Rumble and got himself a spot on Raw by challenging for the world title. It made for a good story and also opened way to make the Raw Rumble outcome unpredictable. That's why we're mentioning it. Raw was weirdly the work rate show. You had Jericho, Benoit, Orton, and Edge, and these guys were always the main eventing the show with a 15 to 20 minute match. And I'd say 2004 Raw is the furthest I've ever seen Raw be better than SmackDown in a year. The show knew its identity, whereas SmackDown had some strange stories like Paul Heyman stealing the urn. It was less freaky though on both. Just when I say that, this image popped up in my mind, unfortunately. The pay-per-view exclusive shows in 2004 might have been a mistake, legitimately. Like 03s, they weren't terrible or anything like that, but 04, Great American Bash 2004, Unforgiven, No Mercy, Armageddon. They started booking these pay-per-views like they knew the money was gonna come in regardless. And at this point, it almost was, because the new stars were starting to become established. 2005 was the year where the brands loosened up. It was the loosest it had been up to that point. From a business standpoint, the brand split was in a much worse place as it relates to the brand exclusive pay-per-views, but the ratings were up on both shows. It also helps that WWE moved Raw back to USA Network, but then SmackDown became the clear number 2. It was obvious in the past, but WWE gave every main event they had to Raw, and Batista became number 2 overnight. It wasn't when he went to SmackDown, but when he stopped main eventing the dual brand pay-per-views. John Cena took his place, and of course it's because Cena had the youth advantage, but I can't say that Cena felt like a bigger star than Batista in June of 2005. Yeah, he sold that rap album. Yeah, he was a chain gang leader, soldier, all that. But let me just put it this way. If I ask you this question, if this match happened at SummerSlam 2005, John Cena versus Batista, who would win? You most likely would answer Batista. Now, SmackDown was good, but I feel like SmackDown at the time was second place in everything, even though it had many stories and matches better than Raw. This hurts the brand split as a whole to have SmackDown be the clear number 2. The SmackDown draft picks were Christian, Muhammad Hassan, Chris Benoit, and Batista. Raw got John Cena, Kurt Angle, Rob Van Dam, and Carlito. The only 2 who were used by Survivor Series time were Benoit and Batista on the SmackDown side, whereas Raw used all 4 of those draft picks and featured them in major matches and stories. The World Heavyweight Championship was the title in WWE, but not so much as the Raw one by the end of 2005, and fans in some ways understood Raw was the A show by this point. The shows as a whole are more similar now. I think in terms of feel during this era, Raw and SmackDown are mostly the same as opposed to how different they were in 03. But it was also becoming less of a surprise to see somebody from Raw and SmackDown and vice versa. There was that big SmackDown versus Raw feud which was much needed, and it's kind of crazy how they never actually did it until 2005, but it was a wonderful storyline. WWE shifted its focus towards Raw more. The buy rates for the brand exclusive shows fell a bit, but mostly on SmackDown's part because Raw was selling HBK and God as a tag team. You know, that's gonna make money. The DX reunion and a pay-per-view with a Hell in a Cell and TLC matches all in one show. SmackDown wasn't doing good, so they decided to bring in John Cena, the Hardy Boys, and eventually Shawn Michaels for the last 2 SmackDown pay-per-views. ECW's launching also didn't help the brand split as a whole, and at that point, fans weren't interested in paying $40 for the events. Imagine paying $40 for December to Dismember, and someone probably did over here, which is unfortunate. I actually still feel bad for you. So WWE reverted to the dual branded pay-per-views, and I can't say it wasn't much needed. Sometimes the events tried too hard or got lazy to sell the events. Sometimes the shows weren't as good as they should be and you had to pay $40 for it. $34.99 I believe, then $39.99. It did lead to some good. That ladder match from Armageddon 2006 stands out. I enjoyed it, but at this point it's like dual branded pay-per-views were the move. Raw was the #1 show, SmackDown was #2, and the main event scene had mostly the same guys. MVP, Carlito, Mr. Kennedy, and Shelton Benjamin never got to that higher level, which basically negates a part of the brand split. A part of the reason it started was to give others new opportunities. And in terms of new talent, none of the new guys became stars. Some of it was backstage things, the fact that they didn't see them as good as they were predicted to be, but the brand split was dying. There was almost no reason to keep it going. Star power took a huge hit, and I'm just thinking to myself, imagine the SmackDown exclusive pay-per-view of late 2007 without The Undertaker, Rey Mysterio, and Edge. It would be tragic. You'd see some nonsense like Crystal Marshall and Vicky Guerrero having a match. It's for the best that the dual branded pay-per-views returned. The buy rates didn't justify a reason for it to continue, and WWE's roster previously was very stacked and strong, but now it was depleted. And it wasn't depleted because guys disappeared, they were just injured. And from here on, they had a better handling of their top guys, so it wasn't an issue over whether or not these guys could be showcased. They had Jericho, Cena, Edge, Batista, Undertaker, DX, Jeff Hardy, CM Punk, Randy Orton, and it's said, but WWE's 2008 roster was stacked. That's the millionth time somebody said it probably. Give me my prize. They didn't need to be separated as hard as they were previously. It was looser. Guys were still on their show, but it wasn't shocking anymore to see The Undertaker on Raw and Randy Orton on SmackDown. SmackDown had their work cut out for them on many occasions, but it's natural for the show to lose stars and rebuild. But for the first time in 2008, WWE actually did a reasonable and equal draft. Triple H, Mr. Kennedy, Jeff Hardy, and Umaga went to SmackDown. Triple H was also the WWE champion at the time, which was the biggest title in the company and the belt to win. So it was interesting, but they did lose Batista and Rey Mysterio. The brand split wasn't enforced as well, but on the bright side, SmackDown, which was better than Raw, was finally being seen as a much bigger deal. Maybe Triple H held things, but they were starting to main event more shows, and this was carrying to 2009. When I say Triple H held things, just his mere presence would allow for the bookers to book it in a more important manner. I loved SmackDown in 2009, but it seemed like WWE themselves loved it as well because SmackDown got the main event of Backlash, Judgment Day, Extreme Rules, Night of Champions, SummerSlam, and Breaking Point. They're split on the Royal Rumble, WrestleMania, and TLC, seeing as both brands are featured in the main event. And WWE gave SmackDown a lot of great things that year. Raw had the same 3 guys in the main event scene with Cena, Orton, and Triple H, whereas SmackDown was a revolving door involving the likes of The Undertaker, CM Punk, Jeff Hardy, Batista, Rey Mysterio, Edge, and Chris Jericho. The stories flowed well and transitioned into the other, and you saw new things as opposed to the same thing. And seeing SmackDown doing well again, they pull their pants down, but this might be the worst or best example of that. 2010, one of the most notorious years in WWE history, a year that in some ways does shape the future of the WWE. SmackDown was better than Raw during this time, but I feel like they needed to drag certain characters away. Batista was the first one gone. He won the title from Cena and just switched brands, then followed the draft. SmackDown was decently sized during this time, but they took away 2 of their centerpieces, Chris Jericho and Edge. Chris Jericho at the time was the best all-around wrestler in the entire WWE. Might be a hot take, but I believe he's WWE's MVP for 2009. I know Jeff Hardy, 09 Randy Orton, CM Punk, but the most consistent performer year-round was Chris Jericho. He was also in the world title match with Edge a month earlier at WrestleMania. They took them, Morrison, R-Truth, and in return they got the Big Show, Kofi Kingston, Kelly, and Christian. Horrible trade, very uneven, and it's very uneven just on the basis of none of those 4 being major stars of SmackDown. Well, actually, Big Show's kind of. But Christian, it took a while for him to get going. Kelly was just around. I don't even remember a single thing she did on SmackDown. And Kofi was the most mid-card talent on SmackDown. I actually believe Orton should have moved to SmackDown that year, but SmackDown was destroyed and had the show led by Jack Swagger. Yeah, that Jack Swagger who WWE were scared to push harder on Raw months earlier. They were terrified of actually pushing him beforehand, and now they decided to do so. Undertaker's return was for nothing after he broke his nose, and that information is important because SmackDown as a whole would have been different if he won the title at Fatal 4-Way. I don't know if Kane would win the briefcase, but when you look at SummerSlam, the show just might have ended up with the brothers facing off anyways if Undertaker won at Fatal 4-Way. SmackDown's depleted and Undertaker became a part-timer. It was really a bunch of mid-carders running the show and Rey Mysterio was the main character. Edge had to go back to SmackDown as a face, which didn't work the first time around, much better on the second try. SmackDown wasn't as strong as Raw though, and with the following changes, the brand split would come to an end. 2011 was the year that saw the previous talent become part-time. This would not have an effect on SmackDown stories much, but some of the part-timers, such as Triple H and The Undertaker, would show up to the blue brand. The World Heavyweight Championship opened WrestleMania, which was absurd to many, and the gap had furthered when it came to the WWE and World Championships. With the year the belt had, it required somebody major to come in and hold it. Edge was supposed to continue with the title, although the extent of his title reign is unknown, but he was forced to retire. Enter Randy Orton. Randy Orton is a name that would make you give a damn about any title, especially in 2011. While WWE didn't see Christian in the same light, it didn't matter because their matches were magic. But when you take away those two, SmackDown is left with Sheamus, Mark Henry, and Big Show. So that feud was doing some crazy carrying. And if you're left with those three, you don't think to yourself SmackDown's gonna have a good run, but they did. I enjoyed 2011 SmackDown. It's just the star power wasn't there and WWE noticed. I forgot about this, but Big Show was drafted to Raw, but it served no purpose after his tag team with Kane. The guy just respawned back on SmackDown like nothing happened. But yeah, those three turned out to be SmackDown's gems alongside Christian and Randy Orton. They were very important for 2011 SmackDown, and it didn't seem that way initially. You know, it felt like they were gonna do the same old stuff, but then they had the Hall of Pain, Sheamus turned face, Big Show had this heated feud with Henry, then Daniel Bryan comes in. There was a lot that was going on SmackDown. The brand split came to an end in August of 2011 with Triple H's storyline allowing for SmackDown wrestlers to show up on Raw. The split was over, but guys still featured on certain shows. Randy Orton showed up on Raw, but John Cena rarely showed up on SmackDown. SmackDown didn't have many guys from Raw showing up, and if anything, SmackDown felt like its own show more than Raw. Raw was straight up called Raw Super Show at the time. It wasn't really different to what it was previously, but the only change being that SmackDown wrestlers could come over. And its own stories would also be explored on Raw as well, just like it was in the Attitude Era. And eventually WWE just abandoned the identity of SmackDown and have Raw guys show up completely after WrestleMania 20, I'd say. But yeah, that's the brand split. Overall, the brand split was never gonna last. WWE is always impatient and they didn't want to give each brand its own identity. SmackDown and Raw at times were different. There was also times where they were the same thing practically, like 05. Personally, I always preferred the Attitude Era roster. They don't have a brand split. Both shows allow for the stories to develop. I always wish that came back, but they never do a good job with it. So we're better off with the brand split. Alright, what you guys think of the brand split? Please comment down below. That's the first video. Make sure you hit the AA on the like button, perhaps the RK on the subscribe button. Peace. I'm out.